I do believe that God limits himself. It's an important part of my theology. God has all power. He is able to control everything that happens if he chose to. However, I believe that in the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ, God limited himself. Paul says in Philippians 2 that though he was in the form of God, he, meaning Jesus Christ, did not think equality with God was something to be held on to, but he divested himself of that, taking the form of a servant. I think that that means that he laid aside his attributes of glory in the sense that he chose not to use them. And so when God created the world, I think that too was an act of kenosis on God's part. God limited himself. He emptied himself of the use of his omnipotence so that he would not be simply controlling everything that we do. He could because he's all-powerful, but he chooses not to. And why would he do that? Because I believe that God's main purpose in creating us is to have communion with us. And this is a difference that I have with Calvinism, because I think in Calvinism, God's main purpose in creating the world was to glorify himself. I do believe that God's creating of us and the world is a glory to him. That is, the world is a theater of God's glory, as John Calvin said. I can agree with that. But I believe that God's main purpose in creating the world and us in it was to have communion with us. That is, God wants to relate to us, and he wants us to relate to him. And I think free will is necessary for that. A relationship in which there is no free will, and one is controlling the other one, is not a real relationship. It's merely a condition imposed by one upon the other. And so I believe that in creation, God limited himself. And I would even go so far as to say that God took a risk in creation. Now, my open theist friends who also believe that God limited himself in creating the world and giving us free will, and who also believe that God took a risk, push me to go further. And they want me to say that in taking that risk, God did not know what we would do with our free will. I'm not willing to say that. I think that God took a risk and yet knew what the outcome was going to be. Again, there's a mystery there. In our experience, usually anyway, if we take a risk, it's because we don't know exactly what the outcome of that risk is going to be. I think in God's case, he knew what was going to happen, and yet it was a risk that he took. The analogy that I use with my students is of having children. When we as parents choose to have children, we know some of what's going to happen. It's still a risk that we take. It's just a dim analogy, an illustration. It's not perfect. But I think it's like becoming a parent when God created the world. He knew that we could misuse our free will, and yet he was willing to take that risk. In fact, he knew what we would do. He knew that Adam and Eve, for example, would disobey him. And yet it still was a risk that he took, perhaps because he didn't know exactly what it would feel like to have his creatures disobey him. So I'm not an open theist, and yet I agree with him. There's much common ground there. The agreement has to do with God's taking a risk and giving us free will.